Today at the National Press Club, Hugh de Kretser, President of the Australian Human Rights Commission, to give the first of what will be an annual assessment of Australia's human rights record and what the nation can do better. Hugh de Kretser with today's National Press Club address.
Hello and welcome to today's National Press Club Westpac address. My name is Ronald Mize and I'm a political correspondent for the Australian Financial Review and also a director here at the National Press Club. Welcome to our program. Our guest today is the President of the Australian Human Rights Commission, Hugh de Kretser. Throughout 2026, the Commission is marking 40 years of promoting and protecting human rights in Australia. The speech today is entitled The Australian Human Rights Assessment 2026. In a political landscape where the intersection of national security, technology change and social cohesion is constantly shifting, the work of the Human Rights Commission has become more critical than ever. As an independent statutory body, the Commission serves as a vital barometer for the nation's values, challenging governments to navigate the tension between responsibility, collective responsibility and individual liberty. Today's address offers us an objective stocktake of where we are. Hugh de Kretser has been advocating for human rights for more than 2 decades. Before joining the Commission, he was the CEO of the Uruk Justice Commission and a Commissioner of the Victorian Law Reform Commission. He is a lawyer and started his career advising companies on employment and anti-discrimination laws. I remind our members that a podcast of this address will be available afterwards, and so please welcome Hugh de Kretser.
Hello and welcome to our inaugural Human Rights Assessment. Human rights are the key to living well. Societies that protect human rights are stronger, healthier, safer and more prosperous. It's in everyone's interest to protect people's rights. Australia's done a lot well on human rights. We've achieved a lot. We live in one of the safest, most stable and prosperous countries on the planet. But our stability, safety and prosperity are not being shared equally. There are gaps and there are failures, and our success is fragile. It's being threatened by major challenges, including polarisation, division, rising racism, climate change, inequality, and rapid technological change. We have a strong foundation to respond, but we must act now. We need to strengthen our human rights and democratic foundations, and we need to reaffirm our commitment to human rights, a commitment which I believe is at the heart of what it means to be Australian. In this address, I'll draw on 2 connected themes, trust and unity. Trust because trust in each other and in our democracy is essential to the well-being of all Australians. And unity because rising division and polarisation risk undermining our human rights progress. I acknowledge the Ngunnawal people and their ancient and continuing connection to the land we're on. I acknowledge Selina Walker and all First Peoples here today. Canberra is an Indigenous word said to mean meeting place. The choice of this word for our nation's capital speaks to the potential for greater unity and healing and building a better shared future where the human rights of this land's First Peoples and of all Australians are realised. Human rights are standards that governments around the world have agreed to uphold so that everyone can lead a safe, free and dignified life. Human rights belong to all of us, no matter who we are or where we come from. They're about being treated fairly and treating others fairly. Human rights reflect values like equality, freedom, respect, dignity, kindness, thinking of others and looking out for each other. Australian values. Human rights have got a long history going back to the Magna Carta and earlier, to the rule that no one is above the law, not even the king, to rules that you can't be punished or imprisoned without due process. And in many ways, human rights reflect the golden rule that runs through the world's major religions. Treat others as you would want to be treated. The modern human rights movement emerged from the horrors of World War II. During the war, Australia and our allies defined our common purpose as fighting for liberty, justice and human rights. After the war and the atrocity of the Holocaust, the world came together and said, never again. To promote global peace, development and prosperity, they created the United Nations and a suite of new international laws and institutions. Australia played a leading role. Critically, out of the mass slaughter and unimaginable suffering, they produced a document that is one of humanity's greatest achievements, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Its first article proclaims that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. These simple words speak to every one of us, and they say, you have value, you matter, you deserve dignity because you are human. These words are grounded in our common humanity. They unite us in our difference. No us and them. We all bleed the same, we all love, we all suffer, we all experience hope, sadness, wonder and joy. The Declaration comprehensively rejected the idea that some humans are worth less than others, a poisonous idea that underpins slavery, colonisation, eugenics and genocide. The Declaration lists 30 articles or rules to protect our rights, including the right to life, to vote, to safety, to expression, health, housing, education, work, social security, and more. These rights set a new global standard that governments must respect in dealing with us because of the mere and vital fact that we are human. The Universal Declaration was followed by binding international human rights treaties which successive Australian governments voluntarily committed to uphold. In Australia, many of us enjoy our human rights without thinking much about them. When we go somewhere, we use our freedom of movement. When we join a trade union, a sporting group, or a community organisation, we use our freedom of association. When we attend a protest, we use our freedom of peaceful assembly and expression. When we attend a place of worship, we use our freedom of religion. When we access public health care, we enjoy our right to health. And when we get a job with fair and safe conditions, we enjoy our right to work. The fact that many of us don't think often about our rights reflects Australia's success, but it also creates risks of complacency and inaction, thinking that human rights are things that matter to other people in other places, often overseas. The reality is that for many people in Australia, human rights are not guaranteed. They are part of a daily struggle for dignity, respect, freedom and equality. If you're a woman living with a violent partner, human rights matter. If you're an Aboriginal family living in overcrowded, substandard accommodation, human rights matter. If you're a gay, lesbian or trans student bullied at school because of who you are, or if you're a person with cognitive disability being restrained and mistreated in a residential facility, human rights matter. And if you're an older person with the onset of dementia, facing the prospect of someone being appointed to make decisions about your money, your medical treatment, where you live and who you spend time with, human rights matter. For many people doing it tough in Australia, human rights matter deeply. And for those living well, we are only an accident, serious illness, or misfortune away from needing a human rights safety net. We're launching this annual human rights assessment because good information on human rights progress and regress is essential to better protecting people's rights. It helps Australians to see where we're doing well, where we need to improve, and where action is needed. It helps governments and civil society to identify risks, set priorities, and respond more effectively. And it promotes transparency and accountability. Australia's history includes profound human rights failures, the shameful mistreatment of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, criminalisation of homosexuality, entrenched discrimination, sex discrimination, the White Australia policy, and more. Many of these failures still resonate today. This human rights assessment is focused on today and how we can build a better future. I'm going to cover 6 topics: democratic freedoms, social cohesion and racism, economic justice, First Peoples justice, safety and equality, and technological change. I can't cover everything, but there's more detailed information on our website for those who want to dig deeper. I'll end by talking about trust, unity, and human rights as Australian values. I want to begin with democracy because it underpins so much of our success as a nation and because it's under threat. A healthy, thriving democracy is essential to ensuring all people in Australia can live well. But democracy doesn't start and end on election day. It's sustained by vital foundations, including press freedom, protest rights, strong public institutions, and the rule of law. There is so much to like about Australia's democracy. Free and fair elections, strong public trust in our elections, a history of innovations like the secret ballot, compulsory voting, preferential voting, and voting on Saturdays. Peaceful transitions of power, independent media, an independent judiciary, low corruption, and more. And we've seen important recent advances like establishing the National Anti-Corruption Commission and improving equality in our parliament. Half of our MPs are now women, the highest level in Australia's history and almost double the number 2 decades ago. But our democracy is fragile and under pressure. We must actively defend it. A decade ago, when I was working at the Human Rights Law Centre, we ran a project called Safeguarding Democracy. We documented an unmistakable trend of Australian governments eroding many of our vital democratic foundations, including press freedom, protest rights, and civil society advocacy. This trend led global monitors to downgrade our democracy. Some things have improved since then, but serious concerns remain and new challenges are arising. Protest in Australia has been critical to so many advances that we often now take for granted, from protecting the Franklin River and the Daintree rainforest to securing marriage equality. Yet governments continue to introduce laws that unnecessarily restrict protest with vague, overly broad, poorly crafted offences and restrictions, excessive penalties and excessive police powers. These laws are repeatedly being found by our courts to breach the freedom of political communication in our Constitution, one of the few limited human rights guarantees in our nation's rulebook. We must better protect our protest rights. On press freedom, Australia lags behind comparable democracies. The weak protection of press freedom here was exposed by the 2019 police raids on the ABC and a journalist's home. Why were they raided? For their public interest journalism, including exposing war crimes. The prosecution of whistleblowers, journalist sources, further highlighted this weak protection. Since then, there's been some progress. The Australian government has taken some steps towards improving federal whistleblower laws, but much more is needed to strengthen protections. The government has also introduced a bill to repeal over 300 unnecessary secrecy offences to strike a better balance between confidentiality and open government. Turning to trust in government, in wealthy countries globally, there's a trend of low and stagnating trust in governments and public institutions. Australia is faring better than many like countries, but we're not immune to this trend. The 2025 Australian election study reported that just 32% of respondents trust people in government to usually or sometimes do the right thing. Only 41% think that government institutions act in the best interests of society. Low trust in government and our public institutions is a threat to our democracy. We must address the forces that undermine trust, and we must ensure that our governments and parliaments earn the trust of Australians and respond to their needs. Our understanding of democracy is also critical, yet civics education in schools is at an all-time low. We need to improve our civics, democracy and human rights education, and we need to address rising division, polarisation and racism, the threats to our social fabric or social cohesion. I want to turn to this now. Social cohesion can be a contested term, so it's important to say what we mean if we use it. It's often described as the glue that binds us together in society. It's the belonging we feel, the trust we have in each other and in our institutions, our equality and inclusion, material well-being, and our political participation. Understood this way, social cohesion is a good thing. Societies with higher cohesion tend to be healthier, more resilient to shocks, and more prosperous. But we also need to be clear about what social cohesion is not. It should never be a call for assimilation and erasing differences of culture, language, and faith. We can come from different backgrounds and proudly be Australian. Similarly, social cohesion must not come at the expense of talking about and achieving justice. Justice and human rights promote social cohesion. I want to focus on a key aspect of social cohesion, racism. Racism in Australia is rising. For First Peoples, it rose with the failed voice referendum. For Jewish, Muslim, Arab, Palestinian and Israeli communities, it rose after the 7 October attacks and the war in Gaza. We must not allow racism to be normalised. We must not accept Jewish families sending their children to schools which have to be protected by armed guards. We must not accept Muslim women being abused, spat at and assaulted. We must not accept First Peoples parents fearing their children and grandchildren will be harmed by police and justice systems meant to protect them. And we must not accept people hiding their faith or their culture when they go out in public because they fear for their safety. Racism harms people. It harms people's identity and self-esteem, their participation in public life, their opportunity to access employment, education and housing, and their health and well-being. Left unchecked, it leads to violence. December's anti-Semitic terror attack at Bondi was a horrific manifestation of prejudice and hatred. 15 people murdered, including a 10-year-old girl, for celebrating their faith and their culture. Then in January, we had a homemade bomb thrown into a crowd of Aboriginal people and allies in Perth in an alleged terror attack. And in February, we had a man in Western Australia arrested for an alleged terror plot to target mosques, police, and the West Australian Parliament, apparently driven by white supremacist ideology. These attacks send shockwaves through the affected communities. When we fail to protect a minority group from harm, we fail as a nation. Australian governments can't control global events like COVID or violence in the Middle East that drive racism, but they can control how we respond here at home. It's positive that the Australian government funded the Australian Human Rights Commission to develop the National Anti-Racism Framework. We launched the framework in 2024 following extensive community consultations. It has 63 recommendations across government and society to address racism in our nation across sectors including justice, health, education, workplaces, media and the arts. The framework enjoys strong support from civil society. Special envoys against anti-Semitism and Islamophobia support it. Yet the Australian government still hasn't agreed to implement any of its recommendations. We're urging the government to set up a task force or similar body to progress implementing the framework in a planned and prioritised way, and we stand ready to work with government on this. Anti-migrant sentiment is also rising in Australia. There's nothing wrong with sensibly debating our migration policy, but demonising migrants is unacceptable. My family on my dad's side migrated from Sri Lanka to Australia in 1949. We were lucky to avoid the injustice of the White Australia policy. My dad arrived as an 8-year-old boy in Port Melbourne with dark skin and a thick accent. He went on to be a world-leading medical researcher and the Governor of Victoria. Australia rightly binned the last vestiges of the White Australia policy in the 1970s. Yet today we have people who seemingly want to bring parts of it back. The March for Australia rallies targeted migration from India. Others have targeted Muslims and migration from Lebanon and Palestine, and scapegoated migrants for social problems, including our housing crisis. These attacks on migrants must stop. They fuel racism, hate, and division in our community. They increase the risk of violence. Migration has made Australia stronger socially and economically. Australians know this. Over 80% of us consistently say that multiculturalism should be supported. We know that diversity makes our nation better. Refugees who have fled war and persecution seeking safety are part of our diversity. We should be proud to have welcomed more than 1 million refugees through our humanitarian program since World War II. Yet Australia's treatment of people seeking safety by sea remains amongst the harshest and cruelest in the world. We should abandon harmful policies like offshore processing and mandatory detention and promote safe pathways for people fleeing harm. I'll now speak about our economy. Australia is a wealthy country. This is good. It gives us the power to ensure that people can live well. But how we share our wealth is critical. Wealthy nations which have lower income inequality do better on a range of things that we all care about, like health, education, social mobility, violence, and child well-being. It's in everyone's interests, including the wealthy, to share our prosperity more equally. On this issue, there's warning signs. Income, and particularly wealth inequality in Australia, are too high. There are increasing concerns around intergenerational inequity. Only 22% of Australians think that the next generation will be better off. Unemployment is currently low, but we have major gaps in workforce participation. We need to make our workplaces more inclusive for people with disability and older workers. We need to make it easier for skilled migrants to work in the fields that they were trained in. And we need redesigned employment services that genuinely help people to get paid work and get rid of punitive compliance frameworks that harm people. The Australian government has taken some positive steps to address the cost of living pressures and inequality. Improving access to Medicare, reducing the cost of medicines, improving childcare affordability, reducing HECS debts and making TAFE more accessible. These are positive reforms. They are human rights reforms. But too many people in Australia live in poverty, and safety net payments for those out of work remain far too low. We need a national plan to eradicate poverty with robust measurement and clear targets. Our housing affordability is also declining. Home ownership is increasingly out of reach for younger people. We've got rising homelessness, and older women in particular have been affected. The Australian government's made significant investments to increase the supply of housing, including new social and affordable homes. More is needed, including greater investment in social housing, strengthening renters' rights, and tax reform. Treating housing as a human right, not as a commodity, would help to spur the right actions. We also need to address the human rights divide between our cities and the bush, particularly in relation to education, health, mental health, jobs, and exposure to the impacts of climate change. On climate change, the Australian government has made important improvements, including committing to reduce climate pollution by 62 to 70% by 2035 and to reach net zero by 2050. But it's not enough. We need to accelerate our transition to renewables to avoid massive climate impacts on people's lives in Australia and globally. The pace at which we cut fossil fuel pollution now will determine how dangerous our and our children's future is. It was a privilege for me to work at the Yurok Justice Commission, the first formal truth-telling inquiry into historic and ongoing injustice affecting First Peoples in Victoria. It changed me profoundly. It deepened my understanding of the connection between culture and identity and health and well-being. And it taught me how injustice has reverberated across generations for First Peoples. Truth-telling is not about assigning blame or guilt today for the actions of the past. It's an invitation to grow our shared understanding of our history and how it shapes the present, to grow our shared commitment to build a better future together in this land that we all call home. A future where First Peoples families have equal access to quality education, housing, and healthcare, where First Peoples communities are prosperous, where country is healthy, and where culture and language are thriving. where First Peoples have power and control over the issues that affect them. The Closing the Gap targets measure inequality between First Peoples communities and the rest of Australia, and I too acknowledge the presence of the great Tom Calma here today. His work at the Australian Human Rights Commission, when he was Social Justice Commissioner, led to the Closing the Gap initiative. There's been positive progress on some of the Closing the Gap targets, particularly early childhood education, jobs, and land rights. But other measures like Year 12 and tertiary education completion are improving, but not fast enough to meet targets. It's important not to lose sight of these gains. It's happening too slowly, but there is positive change. More education, more jobs, more wealth, more prosperity. When I was at Yuruk, I saw so much excellence reflecting this change, from business entrepreneurship to leadership in the public service, to creative and to sporting excellence. There's been mixed progress nationally on truth-telling treaty and representative bodies. The failed voice referendum was a major setback, as was Queensland's decision to abolish its treaty and truth-telling process. But we've seen significant progress in jurisdictions like Victoria and South Australia. I think sometimes people misunderstand why treaty and representation are important. We know that affected communities are best placed to design and implement the solutions to the challenges that they face. They need to be supported and empowered to do so, rather than having inflexible policies imposed on them from afar. Only 4 of the 19 Closing the Gap targets are on track, and some are going backwards. The Productivity Commission has emphasised that this stubborn inequality affecting First Peoples will not properly shift until they have power and control over the issues that affect them. Representative structures and treaty agreements help to deliver this. They should be supported because they're the pathway to a brighter future together. I want to especially call out 2 areas where things are getting much worse for First Peoples: over-imprisonment and the removal of children from families and communities under child protection policies. These outcomes are a result of choices by governments. Choices to prioritise populist, blunt and harmful law and order policies over community safety policies that have been proven to work. Choices to underinvest in supporting struggling families and communities and instead focus on the wrong end of the child protection system, child removal. Mandatory sentencing children as adults, abolishing the principle of detaining children as a last resort. These are lazy non-solutions. At the same time as we're banning children under 16 from having a social media account, the age of criminal responsibility in most of the country is 10. This means that primary school-aged children can be arrested, prosecuted and locked up. And it's First Peoples communities and families who are hit hardest by these laws. Only the ACT and Victoria have raised the age of criminal responsibility. The ACT raised it to 14 with some exceptions. Victoria raised it to 12 but walked back on a promise to raise it further. The Northern Territory recently lowered the age of criminal responsibility from 12 to 10. It's good that the Australian Government has established a National Commissioner for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and young people. It should now show national leadership on this issue by raising the age of criminal responsibility under federal criminal law to 14, and then work with the other jurisdictions to follow suit. The way forward on First Peoples justice is set out in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which Australia endorsed 17 years ago. The Australian Government should develop an action plan to implement it, as recommended by the Parliament's own Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Affairs Committee 2.5 years ago. Safety is a human right. Ensuring all people in Australia are safe is one of the core human rights obligations of all Australian governments. On family violence, we've come a long way. The National Plan to End Violence Against Women and Children was a positive step forward, as was the specific plan to end family, sexual and domestic violence against First Peoples women and children. There are signs that attitudes are improving and the rate of family violence is dropping. but we still have a way to go, in particular for groups like First Peoples, women and children, and women with disability who experience higher rates of violence. The picture in relation to sexual violence in Australia is worse. Rates are not dropping. I started working in community legal centres over 20 years ago. Our small legal centre in Melbourne's Outer West helped women who were victim survivors of sexual assault. Their experiences and the profound harm they suffered remain with me 2 decades on. Sadly, our justice system still fails many victim survivors. The vast majority of sexual assaults are not reported to police. When reports are made, most of those cases do not proceed to criminal prosecution. Of those that do, very few result in a guilty finding. There has been some positive changes and rates of reporting to police are improving, but significant reform is still required, including to increase support for victim survivors and to create more pathways to justice. The Australian Law Reform Commission's recent report outlines the way forward. There is better news on the gender pay gap, which is narrowing, helped by improvements in gender equality reporting. And successive governments have also implemented the Australian Human Rights Commission's Respect at Work reforms to address sexual harassment and sex discrimination in workplaces. There is now a positive duty in workplaces to eliminate sexual harassment, sex discrimination, and other unlawful conduct. This shifts the focus from responding to a complaint after the harm has occurred to stopping the harm before it happens. This is better for everyone. We need the positive duty replicated across all federal discrimination laws, including the Disability Discrimination Act, which is currently being reviewed in response to the Disability Royal Commission's recommendations. We also need to expand federal protections against discrimination on the grounds of religion, while also fixing exemptions that allow discrimination by religious bodies against LGBTIQA+ students, teachers and others. And we need protection against all forms of hate crimes. This was underscored in February when the ABC revealed a string of targeted assaults on gay and bisexual teenagers in Sydney, some apparently inspired by ISIS. The last trend I want to speak to is technological change. The pace of change is outstripping the ability of governments and parliaments to regulate it properly. Existing laws are piecemeal and largely reactive, leaving gaps where harm can occur without timely or effective accountability. Regulation is needed to harness the benefits of new technology while avoiding the harms. We need to do more to address the erosion of truth and the sewer of prejudice and hatred online. We need to do more to regulate the rise of AI and get ahead of new technologies like neurotechnology. And we need to closely monitor the impact and effectiveness of the social media ban on children. It's positive that the Australian government has committed to introduce a digital duty of care to require social media platforms to take reasonable, proactive steps to prevent foreseeable harm from happening. To sum up, my key message today is that there are major challenges facing Australia that threaten Australians' human rights, our quality of life. But we have a good foundation to respond if we act now. Human rights principles help governments to make the right decisions in responding to these challenges. Australia has been a good contributor to the international human rights system that promotes global peace and prosperity. But that system is under severe threat. And our global leadership is needed now more than ever, working with partners who share our values. Leadership includes strengthening our human rights foundations at home. I spoke earlier about how Australia has signed and ratified key international human rights treaties. This is good, but international law doesn't automatically become part of Australian law when Australia ratifies a treaty. People in Australia can't directly enforce the treaty rights Australia has agreed to comply with. It's left to Australian governments and parliaments to implement the treaties back home by passing laws and taking actions to protect our rights. And unfortunately, they haven't done a good enough job of this. Our promises on the global stage are not properly backed up, and our human rights safety net has got holes in it. This is why we need an Australian Human Rights Act. A Human Rights Act would list all of the rights of all Australians in the one place in Australian law and protect those rights. It would require governments and public servants to properly consider and act compatibly with those rights when they make decisions, deliver services, or develop policies. It would foster a better understanding of human rights and build a culture of preventing breaches of people's rights. And it would give people the power to take action if their rights are breached. To give just a few examples, a Human Rights Act with rights to a fair hearing and to equality would have helped to avoid the harm of robo-debt. A Human Rights Act which protects freedom of expression would strengthen press freedom in our country and make it less likely that law enforcement authorities would raid media organisations for public interest reporting or prosecute whistleblowers. A Human Rights Act would help to avoid the injustice that sparked royal commissions into aged care and abuse against people with disabilities. It's a long overdue missing part of the democratic foundations of this country. The Australian Human Rights Commission proposed a model for a Human Rights Act in our Free and Equal report in 2023. Under our model, it would be a normal piece of legislation passed by the Australian Parliament. Parliamentary supremacy would be preserved. This is the model used here in the ACT, in Victoria and Queensland, in the UK and in New Zealand, all of which have Human Rights Acts. In 2024, the Australian Parliament's Human Rights Committee recommended establishing an Australian Human Rights Act based on our model. I started talking today about trust and unity, and I want to end there. Establishing a Human Rights Act would strengthen trust in government and promote social cohesion. It would essentially be a promise backed by legal accountability from the Australian Parliament and the Australian Government to the people of Australia to protect people's rights. It would help bring us together around a shared set of values and define what our nation stands for. Human rights are Australian values. Freedom, equality, respect, dignity, democracy, and a fair go for all. These are the shared values our citizenship booklet talks about. This is what we ask new citizens and visa applicants to pledge to uphold. We need to live up to these values. If we do, we can meet the challenges facing us and bring us closer to a nation where everyone can enjoy their rights and live in freedom, safety, and prosperity. Thank you.
Thank you, Hugh. The aspiration for a Human Rights Act is not new. It's been around for a very long time. You've sort of made it a signature aspiration of your time. Why do you think there is a consistent hesitance and reluctance from policymakers to do this, despite the fact that parliamentary committees recommended your recommendations, etc.?
Yeah, it's frustrating. By the way, my predecessor, Rosalind Croucher, who was the previous president, I think she was a fence sitter on the question of a Human Rights Act before the job. We ran a Free and Equal inquiry, and she became a strong supporter of a Human Rights Act, and that Free and Equal report is the work of my predecessor, which I strongly support recommending a National Human Rights Act. If you look at Father Frank Brennan, who led the National Human Rights Inquiry under the Rudd government, he was a fence sitter on the question of a Human Rights Act after conducting massive national consultations about how to better protect our rights in Australia. He was a supporter of a Human Rights Act. We see consistent support across Amnesty and others have run polling which shows that it's a popular reform. I saw polling from the 1990s saying it was a popular reform. There's a community campaign, I think, with over 150 organisations from all different parts of our community, faith organisations, disability, First Nations and more, supporting a Human Rights Act. So it's disappointing, it's frustrating, but that reform is there. The model is there. The Parliamentary Inquiry has recommended a Human Rights Act based on this model, and government's response is that it's currently considering that reform. And I think the point I was making was, when we look at the challenges we face as a nation, the threats to polarisation, and division, the threats to the social fabric, the Human Rights Act is one of those things that we need to future-proof our democracy with, and it will help to address these challenges and build a stronger, better culture of protecting rights in this country.
A lot of people listening to this debate who just dip in every now and again, they're not necessarily following it closely, might think, oh, that's a good idea, but what does it mean practically for me? How would it actually affect me? So the right to housing, for example, I mean, there's lack of housing is a significant, or getting able to purchase a house is a significant inequality that you've highlighted, but how would enshrining a right to housing change any government policy today? There's already a general demand, a push from all sides that this needs to be done. How would enshrining the policy change that?
Yeah, it would really shift that focus from housing as a commodity to housing as a right. And if you look at the way that some of the jurisdictions in Europe approach renters' rights, for example, there are far stronger protection of renters' rights in Europe than we have here in Australia. And so there's a campaign called Everyone's Home, which is pointing to the need to strengthen rental rights as part of the right to adequate housing. This includes things like minimum standards, making sure there's no unfair rent rises, making sure that you can't be evicted without a valid reason. We need to look at the share of social and affordable housing as part of our supply of housing. It's been a smaller share over time. There's been recent investments, but much more is needed. So looking at human housing as the right to adequate housing as a human right is really about shifting that focus to saying, how do governments and parliaments make sure that people can have adequate housing? How do we ensure the supply of housing? How do we look at planning? How do we look at things like I talked about tax reform before, to make sure that people have adequate housing? And when you look at the rate of homelessness in this country, when you look at overcrowded and substandard housing, we've got a long way to go. And I know the Treasurer is talking about intergenerational inequity, looking at the way that we have concentrated wealth inequality in Australia, and people who are young now face a much steeper challenge in terms of owning a home.
The federal budget is just under a fortnight away. We already have spending as a percentage of GDP at some of the highest levels outside of the pandemic, and a lot of what you're talking about here, if you're a Treasury official or a finance official, you might look at that and go, well, that sounds very, very expensive. How should we be thinking about this in a budgetary context, which is a very political context, I concede, but it is a barrier to some of what you want to achieve here, isn't it?
I think, you look at diversity and equality in our workplaces. All of the evidence shows that more diverse, more equal workplaces do better. They're more profitable. They're more creative. They're more innovative. So we know that it's McKinsey, the New Zealand Human Rights Commission, there's so much data out there showing that organisations, businesses that get it right on diversity do better. So we should be looking at these human rights reforms as productivity measures. We should be looking at the gap that we have for people with disability, not in work. People are being paid substandard wages, below award wages. We're running a project at the moment where we're working with employers and with people with disability and disability organisations to create pathways to change the barriers that prevent people with disabilities getting and retaining meaningful, properly paid jobs in Australia. And so these are these human rights reforms are things that are good for people and good for our economy as well.
I think framing it as a productivity will certainly get the Treasurer's attention.
There's been a lot of focus on that.
Elizabeth Pike from The Australian.
Thank you very much, Ron, and thank you very much, Mr de Kretser, for coming here today and giving us your time. The Equal Identities Report and Youth Explainers the Commission released in March endorsed gender-affirming care for minors, including puberty blockers, despite major reviews overseas having found little evidence for these interventions in children, leading many overseas jurisdictions to approach this with more caution. Do you accept that the science is unsettled and there are serious unresolved risks to a child's rights and questions over whether a child or adolescent can genuinely give informed consent to interventions that may affect their fertility and sexual function? And if so, how does the Commission justify publicly backing the early medical intervention for gender-distressed children, rather than urging governments to prioritise non-medical support while the evidence and long-term outcomes are still in dispute?
Yeah, thanks for the question. We come at it from a human rights point of view. So if you look at the rights of the child, we prioritise the best interests of the child. That is the compass that should guide decisions in this area. Children's right to health, right to well-being, and right to their best interests. And so those explainers that you're talking about, the report that we've produced looks at the best available evidence around medical treatment. And so we know that, and we support the fact that the National Health and Medical Research Council is conducting a review in terms of that gender-affirming care, and will come out with, I think, interim guidelines partway through this year, and then will deliver its final guidelines later on. And so we need to look at the best available evidence to support the well-being of children. And we need to look at the guidance that we have from expert medical bodies, including the AMA, the GP's peak body, the paediatricians' peak body, and they are supporters of gender-affirming care done properly and with appropriate safeguards.
On another matter as well, the Commission has played a role in 2 ongoing court cases where the rights of biological women conflict with those of transgender women, namely Tickle v Skiggle and the Lesbian Action Group's case against the Commission. What do you say to the argument that the Commission is effectively championing the rights of a group of female identifying biological men over those of women in these cases?
We are championing human rights, and so when you look at the human rights framework, I think implicit in your question is a denial of the existence of transgender people. And that's wrong. If you look at the Sex Discrimination Act, it accepts that there is, and it protects people from discrimination on the grounds of gender identity and sexual orientation, and that's appropriate. We know that transgender people in Australia and overseas face huge stigma and discrimination and threats to their safety and well-being. And we need to prevent them from suffering that harm. We need to support them and keep them safe. And we need to support all people's safety and freedom from discrimination. And so when we look at the interventions that we've done in those 2 cases that you mentioned, our compass or our guideline is the human rights that all people enjoy.
Thank you.
Romy Stevens from the ABC.
Thank you, Mr de Kretser, for your address today. The Australian Human Rights Commission has said that it wants to see the women and children with links to former ISIS fighters return to Australia from a Syrian refugee camp. What's your response to those who are saying that this is reckless, and particularly the government's language recently that the women made their bed and now that they must lie in it?
Yeah, we're talking about Australian citizens. We're talking about children. So the children, they're not responsible for the decisions of their parents. These Australian citizens, these children have a right to their well-being, their health, their safety and their best interests being looked after. Australian citizenship should mean something. Under human rights international law, you have a right to return to your country. Australian governments and parliaments should support that right. If you look at the women who they are likely to have mixed stories in terms, some would have voluntarily travelled to that region. Some were children when they went there, went with their families who took them there. Some likely were forced by partners to go there. And so they are Australian citizens. They have a right to return to our country. If they've committed crimes, they should face the law. That can't happen in northeast Syria. It can happen here in Australia, and I understand they've said they would voluntarily submit to monitoring and compliance and whatever things we need to do to ensure national security.
The government's language seemed to shift before Bondi, but can you understand why political parties might have hardened their stance post-Bondi on this matter?
I can understand why, but I'd also point out that I think it was the Morrison government in 2019 repatriated groups of women and children from that area. The Albanese government in 2022 did the same thing, and we should do the same thing now. United States, UK, European countries, Canada, they've all done the same thing.
Thank you.
The immigration debate is very much heating up in this country at the moment. It's polling suggests it's partially behind the rise of the push towards one nation. We're seeing some very vocal policies, or a three-part policy coming from the coalition. The first part was about values, Australian values, and whether people should be denied the ability to come here if they don't comply with our values. How are you viewing that debate, and what do you make of that first stage of the policy from the coalition?
Yeah, as I said in the speech, I talked about those trends of polarisation, division and racism, and this debate is, like I said, we can have a debate, a sensible debate about migration policy, about the levels of migration in this country, but too often this debate is demonising migrants and driving that polarisation and racism, and it's wrong. You look at, and it also, if you look at Australian values, I like the debate about Australian values. When you think this country that was made up of hundreds of independent Aboriginal nations and Torres Strait Islander nations before European settlement, then the abolition of the White Australia policy with people coming from hundreds of countries across the globe. How do we define what it is to be Australian? For me, you define it in connection to those human rights values: freedom, equality, safety, dignity, respect, equal opportunity, democracy, the rule of law, and you apply that to a migration policy. You don't go back to a migration policy that is the White Australia policy that discriminates against people based on the colour of their skin or their faith. You have a migration policy which is fair, and which is equal, and which supports people. And when I look at the existing laws that we have, for those who are interested, have a look at Section 501 of our Migration Act. The powers the Australian government currently has to refuse a visa to someone or cancel someone's visa, including someone who's a permanent resident, are extremely broad already. So it's difficult to see how you could legislate to increase those powers even further.
Do you think there's any merit in the idea, though, that we shouldn't have somebody coming to this country that fundamentally doesn't believe in the things you're advocating here today?
The citizenship booklet talks about the values that we stand for. The new citizens have to make that pledge. Visa applicants have to make that pledge. I think our culture is strong. Our support for democracy, our support for rule of law is strong, and I think people should support those values.
Nathan Smith from News Corp.
Thank you for your speech. Just touching on the immigration debate there obviously has been a surge in that anti-immigration rhetoric and support for parties who are much more critical of migration. Do you view that as a temporary phenomenon? Obviously, a lot of these ideas and debate we have heard before, or is this part of a larger shift in society towards, I suppose, potentially more intolerance? And just over the weekend, we saw Angus Taylor talking about bad people from bad countries. Obviously, there has been a lot of rhetoric around this debate. Are you concerned that politicians are being responsible in how they talk about migration, considering we have seen some real acts of violence?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of questions there. I'll start with the first one. There is a trend of rising populism globally. That's happened, and there's been an anti-democratic trend, if you like, if you look at countries like Hungary or Turkey or India or the United States, and that may or may not be ongoing. We saw a different result in the Hungarian elections recently, but the things that are fueling that trend we absolutely have to look at. People feeling insecure about their jobs, people worried about their countries changing because of technological change, people in rural and regional areas feeling left behind because jobs and access to health, housing, education happen to be in the cities. And so these are human rights problems, and there's human rights solutions to them. So if we want to strengthen the social fabric or cohesion we have as a society, we need to address income and wealth inequality. We need to have our institutions and governments and parliaments responding to the needs of all Australians, and that's why human rights provides a helpful frame to look at these issues in. But yes, these trends are worrying, and again, that's why we need to future-proof our democracy and our system of government in Australia and strengthen the protection of human rights. I think you asked the second question about the language that's used. And yeah, our leaders have a responsibility to choose their words really carefully. You can't, on the one hand, say I'm worried about social division and social cohesion, and on the other hand, stoke it. And so there's been there's been a couple of reports recently. The McKinnon Foundation and the Grattan Institute have put out good reports just in the last month, I think, about the need to look after our democracy and take care of it. And Grattan in particular looked at the language that people are using around, political leaders are using around how we talk about these issues. The Edelman Trust Barometer internationally has said that leaders have a responsibility to promote cohesion, to strengthen our social fabric, not tear it apart.
Thank you.
Nick Stewart, Ability News.
Thanks very much. With the NDIS, when it was introduced, people were very enthusiastic about it. Gradually, as the costs escalated, that social licence has supposedly deteriorated, and until now we have this new legislation we're told will be brought in to change the scheme quite significantly. It will effectively remove some rights from individuals who have them at the moment to gain money from the scheme and to gain supports from the scheme. What's your concern about this change becoming a lawyer's picnic, and what do you think that we need to do in order to actually accept that, well, should government have the right to say we can allocate a certain amount of money to this particular issue, but other issues like children or people with First Nations people, that they also have needs, also have rights, and what happens when these rights come into conflict with one another and it comes down to money?
Yeah. So I think Mark Butler was on this stage, was it last week, and he said that the NDIS is one of Australia's greatest human rights achievements. It is a massive human rights reform. We should be proud of that reform, but we need to make sure that that reform is achieving the outcomes that it intended about empowering and supporting people with disabilities to participate in our lives on an equal basis. And there is a need to look at reforming the NDIS to make sure it's achieving those results that it was intended for. But our worry is that there are thousands of people now, people with disability, and their families, their carers, their parents, who are worried about losing the support that they currently have. And there's not enough information about how the federal and state and territory governments working together are going to provide appropriate support for people who may no longer be in the NDIS under these rule changes. And Mark Orr's here from Flourish Australia. I was on the board of Flourish Australia, a mental health organisation. We're an NDIS provider, and so I sat on board meetings looking at the financial challenges of trying to run an organisation that provided quality care to people with complex and serious mental health issues when the funding model for that made it extremely hard to provide the quality of care, and when we were being undercut by providers who were providing substandard care and marketing and taking clients away from us. So these are some of the challenges inherent in the system. So there's no problem. It's good to look at that to make sure that the investment we're making, and it's a substantial investment, is achieving the outcomes that we want. But yes, worry about the impact on people. We need to make sure the states are shouldering their part of the load, because the states are at risk of retreating from this, and so we need to make sure that those people who are currently on the NDIS who may not be in the future are properly supported.
Melissa Code from the Mandarin.
Hi, thanks for your talk. I was really interested in the point you made in your speech about understanding one another better, and I was tossing over in my mind this difficulty of holding space for uncomfortable truths, hearing someone's grievance, even though it's in direct opposition to our values, and just having space for it, not dismissing it as crazy or so on. And then on the other side, how easy it is to dismiss ideas in the broad human rights reform area as woke. So to those who would hear your speech or your calls for various reform and dismiss it as just woke, what is your response, keeping in mind that, it's about more than just side green, side red, side blue. It's about all of us and the story of who we are.
I think the impact in Australia of the October 7 attack and the war in Gaza revealed how poorly equipped we are as a society to have these conversations. And we ran a project supported by the Australian government called Seen and Heard. And the choice of the name for that project, I think, speaks to some of the issues that you raised there, because that project involved consultations across Australia, working with community organisations with those affected communities, Jewish, Palestinian, Muslim, Arab, and where we could with the Israeli community as well. And the feedback we got was that a huge part of the problem was not listening. And so we called the project Seen and Heard, because part of the answer is making sure the experiences of people who are experiencing profound distress are being seen and heard. And that doesn't address all of the problems, but it goes a long way to doing it. And when I worked at Uruk Justice Commission in truth-telling, part of the promise of truth-telling is to build that better shared understanding where the experiences of First Peoples and the injustice that they've suffered and how that injustice has reverberated across generations, so that can be properly understood by the rest of Australia, so we can work together on a shared basis and understanding. So part of the challenges we have is finding those spaces where you can have respectful dialogue, where people are listened to, and where their distress or the injustice affecting them is acknowledged, and then you work from there, and where our disagreements are resolved through debate, through peaceful protest, and through our democracy.
And then one more question, if I may. I just wanted to pick up on the idea of better tracking human rights progress or regression and having a national measurement for that. There are other kind of high-level ways that different parts of government look at this, or indeed members of the media and the public can understand how we're performing. Things like audit office reports, which are getting better at reading as a layperson, the report on government services produced by the Productivity Commission, or even at some point Treasury's wellbeing framework, which some of the states have advanced in a more sophisticated way. Is there a future where you think some of these measures can link together so that we can make a more compelling connection between human rights progress and fiscal health, for example?
Well, I love this question. It's a human rights nerd's question, so thank you for it. And I've spent too long over the last few months reading a ton of material about human rights measurement and how we better measure progress and regress in this country. And it's good that the Australian government, Treasury, has a new initiative called Measuring What Matters, and it tries to take the exclusive focus or the over focus on economy towards looking at a broader measure of people's health and well-being in this nation, and people should look at it. People should look at the Closing the Gap dashboard that the Productivity Commission produces, because it's an excellent way of judging progress and regress and having that transparency and accountability, and governments have to turn up in Parliament and speak to those failures and that progress every year. So we need to do more of that. We need to build better human rights indicators. This is the start of it. The reason we're doing this today is because we identified the problem, the gap, that there's not enough transparency around how we're going on human rights that Australia has promised to uphold at international law and that are so critical to the health of all Australians and the health of our nation. And so that's what this assessment's about. We will build on it. We will draw on existing data sources that are there, because the ABS does excellent work, Australian Institute of Health and Wellbeing. So many data sources out there. We want to consolidate them and look at them through a human rights lens, and get Australians looking at them through a human rights lens to talk about issues like housing affordability or homelessness, and look at it through the prism of human rights and go, how are we doing? Are we getting better? Are we getting worse? And so that's what today's about, and that's why we're committing to do this and build on it every year.
And our last question, Megan Paul from Women's Advocate.
Megan Paul, the Women's Advocate. President de Kretser, you told the PJCIS that limits on rights must be proportionate and ensure equal protection, including on the basis of sex. Equal Identities recommends extending the AHRC's positive duty to gender identity, making the Commission the enforcer over women's sex-based organisations. Yet the Federal Court found the AHRC misapplied its statutory obligation to the Lesbian Action Group. How do you respond to concerns about Parliament extending these powers in matters of sex and gender?
Can you explain to me what the concerns are that you're identifying?
Yes, women's groups have expressed concerns in Parliament and in the United Nations to the UN level, as well as at a meeting in February with the AHRC itself about how the Commission exercises its powers.
Yeah. So, I mean, the positive duty is about preventing harm from happening rather than responding after a complaint has happened. So it shifts the focus, rather than putting the burden on an individual person who suffered harm to have to complain and then get that system changed so that the system better protects people's rights. It's a bit like workplace health and safety laws, where we've seen a radical shift in approach from responding after injuries happen to actually prevention, and it's led to massive improvements in safety for workers. We want that positive duty expanded across all federal discrimination laws. It's currently only in the Sex Discrimination Act around sexual harassment and sex discrimination, but we want it expanded more broadly. I think some of the questions you're talking about are around the intersection between trans rights and women's rights. I don't see great conflict there. I see that improving the rights of women and improving the rights of trans women and trans men are equality objectives that we should aspire to. And we can have a debate and a dialogue about some of the issues that you want to speak to. But again, when that question about gender affirming care, what is the compass that we have as a public institution when we look at that? That compass is human rights law, and you look at improving the human rights of all people for children, acting in the best interest of children.
The question is about proportionality and how the Commission uses its powers. The Commission sought a costs order against the Lesbian Action Group but lost. If Parliament extends these powers, what guarantees can you give to women's organisations that the Commission will use them proportionately?
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that costs order provision, but yeah, we have accountability, as all public institutions do. The federal court decision you're referring to said that the tribunal's decision, so we made the decision about the exemption, the tribunal looked at it, made a fresh decision. They stand in our shoes. They made the same decision. The federal court has said on two of the grounds that the tribunal needed to look at different criteria in the way, so the tribunal will now go away and make a new decision, and we'll participate in that and support that process.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Thank you to our questioners, and thank you to Hugh for your time today. Please join me in thanking Hugh de Kretser.